So I thought about the issues that seem to be of significance to this inquiry. So I'll just go through a few of them as I see them. There are some basic trends and some discontinuities that I think most of us are aware of, but worth highlighting. The first one is fragmentation of knowledge and practice in the law. So I finished my law degree over 40 years ago. I went almost straight away into corporate law, and for a number of years. But if I look at the number of fields of knowledge and the number of types of practice that law graduates go into, it just continues to broaden and fragment. And one of the things that I think we lose sight of is what are the fundamental contributions that a legal education gives a person, forgetting about the content stuff. We are remarkably good at deconstructive logic. And sometimes that can be counterproductive socially, because you tend to pull the wings off flies a bit much, but it's fantastically important as a basic skill. And I think that's one of the reasons why lawyers tend to pervade lots of areas and do it very well. And I think it's something that's worth bearing in mind as a fundamental skill. Second trend is interconnection of almost everything, including our machines, and an explosion of knowledge. So the number of areas that people need to be on top of and need to understand continues to increase. And this is associated with acceleration. And the thing that's become much stronger in Australia is politicisation of the legal system and legal issues. In a moment, I'll deal with the sort of issues that I deal with, which are different, I would expect, and those dealt with by most lawyers in an urban context. But almost every set of decisions seems to be now have a strong political component. And I'm not sure how well lawyers are trained in that. It's not something that we train people in, but I think it's an important issue. Then, of course, we have technology and its growth, and I'm sure that's been raised a number of times. And then there's two issues that are distinctly relevant from our point of view, and that's rurality and remoteness. They're not the same things. So, if you look at the kind of issues that occur in remote and rural communities, many of them are the same as in urban communities in terms of, human relations give rise to issues that make it to law and property and all those other things. We have all those things, each with a different sort of context. But a couple of other things are of real significance. The first one is the effect of distance and the inability to access services, which I know the Law Society is very concerned about that, but it is a really fundamental problem. It's an absolutely fundamental problem. And partly because lawyers contribute more than just technical advice. They form part of the social network and the cultural context of communities, and very often they have leadership roles in communities. So the lack of those skills in rural areas, which have been well documented, is more than a problem of direct legal services. Particularly when you look at indigeneity. So now roughly 40% of Australia's lands are under some form of Indigenous ownership or supervision. And you think, okay, that's a good thing, and it is a good thing, but bear in mind that on a per capita basis, we're richer than many countries, but on a per hectare basis, we are about as poor as Mongolia. We have large amounts of land, few people, and in the rural and remote areas, and particularly Indigenous areas, we have very poor people who are struggling to do many things that, from an urban policymaker's point of view, make absolute sense. You think this is a really great idea, we should make people responsible for A, B, C and D. And one of the issues in terms of a trend that's worth considering on is just incapacity and the problems of incapacity that go with the well-documented problem of a bigger gap between the rich and poor. Our university has as a law school, it's been going for around 20 years. We have a couple of things I think that we contribute fairly uniquely that relate to that. Universality of opportunity for people who are remote. So, for example, amongst our cohort of students, we have had over many years cohorts from the Navy. Had people doing their law degree whilst under the sea in a submarine. That's a different kind of a thing, and it's part of the future. Maybe not everybody in more submarines, but that issue of equality of access, different ways of accessing opportunity is something that's occurring everywhere. How do you marry that with traditional culture, which we try actively to do, and the basic skills? So as a rural law school, we can do some things that are quite, that are committed to that, like, for example, our use of mooting as a way of building a basic skill. But we can't, for example, easily offer clinical legal education. It's economically and structurally very hard to do that from a distance point of view. We can do a great deal to advance online engagement and the use of online resources. We can demonstrate that our students are in many ways far more enterprising than students that have face-to-face activity, because they have to be to get resources. So they learn skills even partly from just the challenge of a different mode of delivery. We know from the research that's available that there isn't a demonstrable difference in quality of outcome from face-to-face or online. That's pretty clearly established. But it depends upon the pedagogy and the quality of the educator, which is the same regardless, but there is a different pedagogy, a different way of dealing when you're dealing with digital engagement versus face-to-face. So that's something that we think we do fairly well, and of course Aboriginal issues are really important, and it's something that we put a lot of work in on. So in terms of issues that are of significance to this inquiry and the future issues and things that we think could be of relevance, there's a few of them. The first one is to recognise the unique generic competences that come from a legal education, to move beyond the technical competence and really think about what does a law training do to people. And there's two. I mentioned deconstructive logic, but the other thing that seems to me, and we're losing the opportunity to exercise this, I think, is you can't go through a law degree without having to really engage with issues of social justice. I think you'd go through an economics degree, for example, and never worry about it. I think you could just go through that without a difficulty, but law schools tend to have values as pervasive, as an area of discourse. That is absolutely a fundamental distinction and fundamentally important. I could explain why if people want more explanation. So how do we make sure we keep those things going into the future, and how they make sure they don't get discounted? Second thing into the future is the idea of digital citizens. That's what we're into now. Those of us who have children, those of us who are young enough to be part of that, it is just so pervasive. And how do we, as lawyers, make sure that the system works properly and deals with those incredible new issues that are emerging, that are just part of the, big data as an example. It's just so different from the stuff that when I studied IP. The third basic thing is this social and geographic divide, the urban-rural thing. It is incredible how insensitive urban policymakers and their advisors are to the reality of non-urban contexts. How their expectations of what people can do and how they do it are just incredibly out of touch. That's because I think most lawyers are urban people with urban interests. So as a challenge that's worth highlighting is, how do we sensitise the system to be more realistic in its expectations and the way that it goes about dealing with issues that are outside of the urban mainstream, because it is now the mainstream. The next issue is internationalisation, which we all know of. I don't need to labour that anymore, but basically training lawyers to be able to live in that world. It should, and some institutions have done this quite well, it should be possible for us to properly train lawyers to deal across different jurisdictions. There are some things that are generic, some things which are discipline specific or which are doctrine specific. And the last one, which I've touched on briefly, is how can lawyers and the values and the strengths of reasoning that are, I think, pervasive of our profession, how can we regain policy leadership? Because when I look at public policy debate and I look at where law gets positioned as a merely instrumental component. Whereas if I think of the history of jurisprudence and all of those things, I think of how the law led major developments in how we think about social justice and society and how to organise society, and that made its way into law. Now when I look at the debates and we read, it's almost all about benefit cost. The values part is diminished to a political side story, And I think that's an extremely dangerous development in society and something where law probably could reassert. So that's my few minutes of fame.
Can I ask you how you see the legal profession in about 20 years' time, and will the profession look or appear to be different whether you're looking from the perspective of a city lawyer or a lawyer out in the country?
There is an inexorable trend in professions, which is that they split into increasingly fine specialisations. That's just a generic pattern. So that's going to continue to happen in law. So we will have more and more seemingly distinct professions that will, or sub-professions that will interweave in unique ways and create forms of practice and forms of delivery and forms of knowledge that we don't know about. At the moment, they're not configured that way. And we could probably begin to identify what some of those might be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what's going to happen with from a rural versus urban. What will be different? The fundamentals of disadvantage for large parts of rural communities will still be there and possibly will be worse. That would be an awful thing, but I think that the challenges of delivering good legal support to people of disadvantage will continue to be a significant characteristic of rural practice, but it'll probably be more difficult. Of course, there'll be more use of digital mechanisms, but then that means we're going to have more problems of digitally disadvantaged citizens as well. So I think those are some of the other challenge that's going to arise, I think, is increasingly large amount of foreign ownership and the intersection of that, social justice issues, and the constraints imposed by free trade agreements. You know, what can we actually do when you are constrained by how you can affect certain interests, foreign-owned interests? I think that's going to be a more difficult problem.
Foreign ownership of law firms?
No, of rural assets, of land, water, all those things. I think that's going to become a new dimension that we haven't yet really seen.
You said that there was essentially no difference between face-to-face teaching and online teaching. I was wondering if you could just expand on that, please.
There's obviously a lot of difference.
In terms of outcome?
The qualitative outcome. I can. So there's been a bunch of studies, and I think the issue, it's like the rest of our lives. We do stuff with digital delivery that we used to do face-to-face, and yes, it has changed how we do it. It hasn't, and it's changed how it feels. It hasn't necessarily changed the functional quality of the outcome. So functional quality, it seems that it's broadly comparable. And from the statistics that we have from looking across our law school versus other law schools, we get incredibly high levels of satisfaction on all measures. So we're pretty confident on that. And from what we hear, when our people go out into their various jobs, those who do go through law school straight into jobs, there's no indication of a difference in the quality. But there are differences in how they do things, what they're comfortable with. So it all depends upon the quality of the pedagogy and the quality of the people who are delivering that.
I'll ask you this: where does the responsibility lie for making sure that graduates from university are able to fit comfortably into the legal workforce? In other words, hit the ground running.
Look, we take that issue very seriously, and that's why, for example, the focus on moot courts and a lot of the stuff we do is our school is quite traditionalist in our focus. We're very much focused around practice, preparing people for practice. Who's responsible? I guess everybody is. Maybe there's a lot more we could do. It would be interesting for the profession to think about how it can really get on top of digital engagement and digital preparedness of students. We still don't really do that in the last stage of getting people moving from law school to practice. I don't know of anyone who does that. It's something that might be worth considering.
I was going to ask you, how do you see the provision of legal advice and legal services to the rural community changing and innovating in the near future?
Well, I think we're already seeing, of course, a lot with the use of digital means. So that's happening, and it's inexorable, and it's just going to change things. And it's interesting, the things that are most significant, like not in law, but the most significant use of online technologies that I've seen in the farm sector is the use of a simple head camera so that a farmer can be working on his tractor and the mechanic back in town can just see what's going on and tell him there and then what to do. You know, it's little things that will make the big differences in the way services are delivered. So I just see more and more of that pervasiveness of technology as a way of communicating in particular. I think that will continue to occur.
And do you feel that will better service your clients in the rural? Do you think that will better service the clients in the rural community?
Those that have the access and comfort with access. The risk is that we are working on the basis generally that everybody is going to have it, and universities doing the same thing. Yeah, we're all going. We want to have stuff that uses a lot of broadband because that's where the gee whiz is. But there is still going to be a significant part of the population who are very disadvantaged, who just won't have that technology access. So my feeling is the divide will get greater, and that we will need much more assertive ways of dealing with those who are not only economically disadvantaged and socially disadvantaged, but are also technologically at a disadvantage. That'll be a new challenge, I think.
The question I wanted to ask was in relation to the Australian Centre for Agriculture and Law.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my understanding is that you head up that centre and it uses multidisciplinary methods.
Correct.
And one of the things that we're told is that lawyers need exposure to other disciplines.
Yep.
So I was just wondering if you could sort of elaborate on that a little.
So we focus primarily, well, we focus on three issues, but one's emergent. We focus on effective environmental governance in rural areas, and the effectiveness is an empirical problem. It's not only a doctrinal problem. So of necessity, if we're concerned with effectiveness, we have to use other methods as well as traditional doctrinal methods. So water policy issues and land use, and of course the horrible conflicts around land clearing and all those things, you can't deal with those looking at them from within the law. You have to look at the law from other frameworks. So we've developed a body of frameworks which are now being applied in different countries. We just did a major project developing a methodology for evaluating the effectiveness of environmental law, which has been applied in 6 countries to, can we do it objectively, not just the way that we've traditionally done it through law, which is just by debate. So, and with Indigenous stuff, we've used a systems approach to trying to work out how to overcome the problem of Aboriginal people not benefiting from traditional culture. So we took a systems method saying if we won't get a sui generis law to protect Indigenous cultural interests, then is there an alternative? And that we took a different kind of modelling approach. So we think in terms of in our areas of interest, increasing the world is saying the problem is effectiveness, not more instruments. The model of that failed, let's create another one that looks exactly the same it's just a pathway to nothing. And so we're trying to engage with that issue using some new methods to do that. And multidisciplinary, we make sure that half of our team, so virtually all of our lawyers have got another discipline as well, and roughly half of our team come from outside law into law.